Well, Richard, it's getting on. I guess it's time to start.
Yes, yes,
And,
indeed.
and hello, everyone. We've got, as usual, lots to talk about today. Here's some of the stories. For our top news story, a town is the first in America to ban new gas stations. And Richard asks, is the tide turning? In technology and electric vehicles, we need so many electric cars and batteries, but will the world produce enough? Can we do it through recycling batteries? For graphene and materials, we're apparently about to redesign our whole electrical infrastructure. In space, there have been two historic flybys of Venus. In energy, yes, fusion is here and it's breaking records. In biology, what are blockchains and what's that got to do with how we define life? For us, people, Richard asks, should we get fecal transplants from our grandchildren? He asks this because fecal transplants have reversed signs of brain aging in mice. And in medicine, the Moderna's mRNA HIV vaccine is about to start human trials for even more diseases. So that's what we'll talk about today. And now, Richard, what's this in our top story that a town is the first in America to ban new gas stations, with you wondering, is the tide now turning?
I had this as the top story because it really is an early step in the change away from gas-powered cars. Gas stations have been around in the US since 1905, and now Petaluma, California, recently enacted a law that limits any new gas stations from being built or existing gas stations from adding pumps. And this was really started by a teenage girl, Emily Britt, who was 17 when she got this started, and she was worrying about her younger siblings. She's got a 12-year-old sister and an 8-year-old brother, and she was wondering, what's it gonna be like in the future for them? And she band together with other student activists and began to break one link in the fossil fuel chain. And then in March in Petaluma in Sonoma County, just north of San Francisco, it became the first city in the US to ban future gas station construction or any new pumps on existing sites. And this is the beginning of what could be a seismic shift. California now has the highest sales of EVs in the country. And in the first quarter of this year, close to 11% of all new car sales in California were electric. So the transition is further along in California than it is in most other places. And it makes you wonder, what is the future of the 168,000 gas stations that are existing now in the US? I don't think they're going to just change them to charging stations. Right now, about 80% of EV charging is done at home. And because even a fast charge now takes about 20 minutes, that's not how long you want to stop at a gas station. So we're going to charge our cars either at home or at work or in other facilities, and they're getting fast chargers, and they're building a special infrastructure for that, hopefully. But the page is turning in Sonoma, and that actually EV sales are so high that they're struggling to provide enough charging stations to cope. And again, the long-term shift and mass closure of gas stations also is going to create another problem with this change, and that is these 168,000 gas stations. Typically, a gas station leaks about 100 gallons of gas annually. That doesn't sound like much, but you put it together over a decade or 20 years, and it is an enormous amount of pollution of the ground. And what are we going to do? As these gas stations disappear, these poisoned plots will present an environmental problem of monumental proportions. And so the change is coming. But the people who are involved in this change are saying it's just a first step. Hopefully, the next step is more charging stations, cheaper EVs, better public transportation, and more bikes. But you have to start somewhere. And if this movement about closing gas stations or restricting gas station gains traction nationally, it's also easy to see how this could be dragged into the culture wars. So we have no masks, but keep the gas stations. But as more affordable alternatives for transportations emerge, this is going to seem like a less and less extreme idea. So change is happening, and this time it starts in Petaluma, California.
Any thoughts?
Yes, actually, California is 11% of new vehicles are EV. In the United States, it's just around 3%.
Right.
And in Norway, I believe it's 75%, Richard, or is it 80?
Wow.
So the other alternative is to make more public transportation, maybe electric, and that would mitigate the gas stations that have to close and maybe have the trips to the public transportation shorter, and thereby helping in that way.
I would argue that gasoline is not so much an issue as methane, as natural gas, like is vented in the Permian Basin in Texas, and that we use for cooking. Natural gas being just methane. Gasoline is horrible. Methane is even worse.
Well, if you read the article, it said something like a tank full of gas eventually results in 9 kilograms, I think it says, typically of carbon. So if you multiply that number by the number of cars that are on the road, the amount of carbon that's being added to the atmosphere by car is really phenomenal.
John, the issue is that methane is, 20 times, Richard, more devastating than CO2?
I read many numbers. One of them I read is 95 times.
Very good.
Methane is not the primary fuel for cars, is it?
Not not for cars, but cars constitute a small environmental impact compared to the methane emissions.
Well,
You know, but
so
methane, when methane is burned, it actually creates much less CO2 than when gasoline is burned or when coal is burned. So it's only methane that escapes and is unburned that is a particularly difficult greenhouse gas.
I agree absolutely. But the natural gas distribution system in the United States oftentimes was built 100 years ago and is not
it's leaky.
And it's leaky as hell. And the gas that comes out of the oil fields, the methane gas, which is more easily controlled, is horrible.
Anyway, that's still another subject. This is getting rid of gas stations as a part of getting rid of internal combustion engines. And this getting rid of internal combustion engines now is such a almost a done deal that even fairly conservative organizations see it as a complete changeover within the next 20 years. Anyway,
But
and it's going to have lots of implications.
I would argue that the transportation vehicles do not contribute as much damage to the environment as methane. Whether it's from the oil fields or from cattle or wherever.
It also turns out if you have a compost pile, as your compost is decomposing, then it releases methane gas.
As a matter of fact, from where they dump garbage, they now recover the methane.
Right.
Yeah. But I think that the issue with electric vehicles, somebody needs to do a comprehensive study and produce a kind of report of what the future looks like. And then other people could contribute by studying different aspects of it. Yeah.
There's a lot of that is being done, and we talk about some of it each week.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the this weekly science thing that I put out, there often are at least half a dozen articles on the subject each week.
Yeah, I mean, can we have everybody plugging their car in to charge overnight? I mean, someone said to me that the electrical distribution system wouldn't cope with that, but I don't know about all these things. Yeah.
And I can move on to our next story on electric vehicles, which is in some ways a continuation of our first one.
Yes.
With people a lot wanting to get a lot more electric cars around climate change and all that, the question becomes, will we be able to produce enough of these cars and enough of these batteries? And could we perhaps do the batteries through recycling existing batteries? Tell us about that.
All right. Now, in the next decade, the number of EV batteries we're going to need, if all these projections are anywhere nearly correct, is we're going to need to increase our production around the world by a factor of 7. So that's a big increase in these lithium batteries. And then, we see the evidence of the change with major car makers moving from dragging their feet in developing EV models to turning their entire fleets to EV models. So the manufacturers see the change, and this change, is a massive industrial conversion that marks a shift from transportation that is presently fuel intensive, that is gasoline, to a material intensive energy system, which are these batteries. And they say in the coming decades, hundreds of millions of EVs will hit the road. And each of them is going to carry a massive battery inside of them, and each of these batteries contains many kilograms of materials that are not yet mined around the world. And because there is this concern about the change, here, let me show you a couple of pictures of this. This is a chart that shows the projection from the current time over the next 20 years and moving from internal combustion engine to battery electric cars. And you see by the time you're 20 years out, 2/3 of the cars are projected to be these battery electric. And the question is still, how do we produce enough batteries? With what we have been doing with the batteries now, one of the enormous changes is we're producing them at a much lower cost. The cost, since they were introduced about 30 years ago, has dropped by a factor of 30, which is a pretty significant drop. And this is one of these curves that you see this typical in technology areas. And this drop in the battery cost is one of the reasons why they think that one of these critical materials is lithium, and they have moved lithium so far down the cost curve that they think it's likely lithium will remain the main battery material for some time to come. There are a couple of other materials, though, that they are concerned about, and one of them is cobalt, and another is lithium. Right now, a typical battery pack in a car has about 8 kg of lithium, 35 kg of nickel, and 14 kg of cobalt. And so they think lithium will be okay. And in fact, now there are lithium reserves that are already identified that are enough to carry us through the middle of this century. And as these reserves are used up, they're going to find sources for more material. That's happened in a lot of other cases, and they think it'll happen here. So they're not worried about lithium production. They are, however, worried about cobalt, which is much more valuable than lithium and is in a much shorter supply. 2/3 of the global supply of cobalt is in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So there's a very narrow set of source, and there are lots of concerns about child labor and concerns of health and things like this that are involved in that mining. And there might be alternative sources. The most promising one are nodules found in the seafloor, and they would have to start some big underground mining process. Basically, you have vacuum cleaners sucking up the cobalt nodules, and that's an environmental problem. But laboratories have been experimenting with low cobalt or cobalt-free batteries, and after some false starts, there are researchers who have solved that problem and showing that cobalt can be eliminated from the cathodes without compromising performance. And in fact, Tesla says it plans to eliminate cobalt from its batteries in the next few years. So they know how to deal with cobalt, and researchers now consider the cobalt problem essentially solved. The next one is nickel. And though it's not as rare as cobalt, it isn't cheap either. And if you look down the road, we're heading straight for a nickel problem. And so they're trying to figure out how to remove nickel. And they have some approaches that look promising. They haven't got them finished yet, but they've made enough headway finding materials that they're very hopeful about that. So that gets us to recycling. And right now, the way that they recycle these batteries is first, they put them in a big shredder. So that's your battery shredder. Doesn't that look high tech? And then they give them a chemical bath or something like that to remove the different chemicals and produce salts of the minerals, and are able to recover the minerals from the salts. So they can do it. It's not easy. And right now, the recycling is pretty much paid for by the cobalt in the battery, because cobalt has a high value, and the recovering of the cobalt is enough to pay for the recycling costs. But if they get rid of the cobalt in the batteries, then that's not going to help the problem at all. And they say that recycling will become much more profitable if it just skips the shredding stage and you take the cells apart directly. So now they are developing techniques to separate out materials using ultrasound, and these works the best if the battery packs are laid flat within the battery case rather than rolled up in cylindrical cells like is commonly done now. And so there are approaches that they can take to making the batteries that are going to make them a lot easier to recycle. And that's one of the things that's going to be done. The other problem, though, with recycling is these batteries just last too long. And so to accumulate the millions of batteries that would make recycling this profitable enterprise is going to take a while, because right now the typical life of the battery is 20 years. And after a car is worn out at the end of about a decade, then nowadays, instead of recycling the batteries, they take them out and use them for other applications like stationary energy storage. And after 10 years, these batteries are still awfully good. The battery will have lost at most about 20% of its capacity. So it's still real good. So it's hard to get much of a recycling effort going until these batteries have been around in volume for 20 years. And that's going to be a while, because we're a long way from it yet. So anyway, they think in terms of the basic materials that it takes to make the batteries, that we will be okay. We'll be okay because of existing reserves of lithium and new battery technologies that they're developing that will lower the need for these other critical methods. But the future still has yet to be finally determined, and there are lots of moving parts. And so we'll see how it goes.
Any thoughts?
Well, I think with the coming of electrical vehicles, there's going to be a stampede by companies to make better batteries and perhaps without some of these critical elements. So I'm optimistic for the future. I also recall, Richard, that one of your previous, the story was about graphenes helping or being part of improving batteries. I don't remember exactly how, maybe.
Right. It was layers of lithium and graphene used together, kind of sandwich. And those kind of advanced technologies are not even included in this article. Their assumption is lithium right now, the existing technology is so cheap that even if you have the new technology, it's going to be at a whole different place in terms of the price curve, and it will take a while to be able to be cost competitive.
I hate to sound futuristic, but I'm wondering what metals and rare earths are available on other planets that can be brought back to our planet inexpensively.
I would not mind the other planets. That's what they're trying to find in the asteroid belt. You know, so there actually are missions now that are doing that, exploring mineral contents of asteroids. And one of the countries that is leading in that research is, you know, Luxembourg is this real big space power, right? Well, it turns out Luxembourg is big in money, and they see there's a lot of money in those asteroids, and they are funding a multi-decade long project to be the leader in asteroid mineral extraction.
Seems quite valid, because bringing stuff back to Earth costs very little.
That's right.
Compared to sending stuff from Earth to
right.
other places.
Yep.
Yeah.
One interesting thing in this article is the where it shows that 50% of the new vehicles in 2035 will still be fossil fuel powered. And
Right.
So there'll still be an awful large demand for refinery products and so on. So
that's right. So it
we'll
gets the
still
oil
be
company
puking out
time.
a lot of CO2. Yeah.
Right.
But at the same time, if trucks and buses are electric rather than just passenger cars, it really changes the dynamics tremendously.
Mm-hmm.
So what if a lot of passenger cars still use internal combustion engines? It's the trucks and the buses that can alleviate a lot of our fossil fuel consumption and transportation.
Now, the buses, we know that China is going gangbusters producing electric buses, and they're broadly implemented in China and starting to show up in other places, even Mexico. For the long distance trucks, they're still a different kind of problem because they need so much power to pull heavy loads over long distances. But it looks to me like the leading candidate for long distance trucks is hydrogen.
Maybe, but we had to remember at the same time, locomotives have been hybrid electric for what, over 50 years.
Right.
Diesel electric has powered the US rail lines, and they consume a lot of diesel.
Right.
Yeah. I don't think that capitalism can be left to solve the problem on its own. I think there is a need because, you know, some of these things, the payback is not quick enough for people to invest. So there has to be some kind of regulation so that, you know, you can look 20 or 30 years ahead and see what the needs will be. Because when all the cars they're producing now are 20 years old, you're suddenly going to have, you know, an awful lot of batteries available. Yeah.
Well, they say part of the problem with capitalism, the way that we do it now, is that capitalism is extractive, is a word that I read in the critiques. And it seems like that extractive nature of the capitalism that wants to keep growing has gotten us into the problem we have now.
Yeah, and I think that recycling is worth it, whether anybody can make money at it or not. You know, the hardware store near where I live, they collect batteries and everybody takes them in. I mean, that should be encouraged. It doesn't matter whether it pays off or not. You've got to create a culture where people believe in conserving resources.
Mm-hmm.
Richard, for our last electrical story, this is not about extracting things, it's about redesigning. Now tell us about this electrical infrastructure that's been around for so many years and that apparently we're about to redesign it.
Now, the as Fred was saying, our electrical infrastructure really has remained unchanged since World War II, but they are making advances in materials that are going to make changes possible there and will set the stage for the next generation. And the stress we put on our electrical grid right now is enormous, with millions of households and thousands of amps of current. And so we're talking about, with all of this power and current, one of the issues is heat generation and ability to handle extreme temperatures, and the temperatures are only going to get worse as this climate changes. And so scientists have looked at this and identified that a key problem is improving the thermal conductivity of materials, but making materials that can conduct heat better alone is not good enough. And you really need to look at the materials from a multi-function point of view, where they have to meet electrical, thermal, and mechanical requirements. Mechanical has to do with the physical strength of the system. And the thing is, they believe that having materials that are good in one of these three dimensions are not good enough. You have to improve your material where it's better in all three dimensions at the same time. And so, you know, again, we're in this funny age in terms of material, where we're able to create materials and kinds of materials that have never existed before. And what looks promising for this are composite materials that are made with nanoparticles and polymers, which are basically plastics. And they are able to make them now where they have thermal performance that are the same or better than metals, and they retain the advantages of polymers, which means they're lightweight and not susceptible to corrosion, and they're easier to fabricate. And some of these most promising materials that they're working on have close to 100 times the thermal conductivity of conventional polymers. So they're making heavy development there. And these developments, they think, will end up bringing improvements in many aspects of our life. And one of the things that we will get will be a dependable, renewable-based power grid. These kind of improved insulators are one of the keys to this power grid. And this is going to end up meaning, among other things, that again, we have the power available, the grid can handle it. And for example, you will end up being able to do things like cool your power plant with air instead of water resources. You're also, all of the electronic components that have the semiconductors in them, the semiconductors are dense collections of transistors. Each of these transistors generates heat. And the problem that exists in all of these electronic devices now is getting rid of the heat. And these improved insulators and conductors are going to be one of the things that helps the electronic components be able to handle this next generation of change.
I've got a comment, Richard. CFE currently loses 30% of its electricity in high tension transmission.
Yep.
30%.
I know, 30%, exactly.
And
how many coal-fired power plants is that in Mexico?
Well, the odd thing is, Keaton and I, our grandfather, 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, was working up in Cerro de Pasco in Peru at 14,000 feet. And he did a study on high voltage transmission losses at altitude. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the problems in Mexico.
Right, right.
Because a lot of our high tension transmission is not at sea level.
Right.
It's at high altitude.
With all those mountains.
Yeah.
Yep.
Keaton, do you have a thought?
Well, yes. One thing that has not been mentioned is superconductivity at low temperatures.
Right.
That's another approach to reducing losses on high voltage transmission.
And they're working madly on it, but we don't have any solution at the moment.
Well, it's hard to cool, transmission lines over great distances, clearly. But for close in at hydroelectric plants, perhaps it is a solution. Incidentally, on the subject of diesel locomotives, I thought I'd add, they started in 1925 in the United States. That is 98 years ago, they had diesel electric locomotives. Mm-hmm. Amazing.
And
here
also
Hawaii,
someplace like Norway, they are a system that is using hydrogen instead of diesel. So that change has started in locomotives too. I'm sorry, I interrupted you as you're
not at
talking
all.
about Hawaii.
Yeah,
I didn't think there was much of a train system in Hawaii.
Actually, they have cane trains to transport sugar cane, but they don't use them anymore. No, but we do have diesel electric buses, hybrids, that are much like the diesel electric locomotives, but they have batteries. So they run part of the time just with electricity. You hear the diesel engine stop. The bus system here is excellent, and senior citizens, and of course I'm not one, but purportedly pay only $35 a year to ride as many buses as they wish. That
Okay.
cuts down a lot on emissions.
Yes.
Sorry to
And
divert you from your path
having
there, but-
senior citizens riding in the buses instead of driving in their own cars probably adds to traffic safety.
Indeed.
If one can pay $35 a year for public transport, why would one have a Tesla on order?
Richard, there's another factor, and that is over time decentralizing the power grid and having more local using solar cells, wind, whatever.
Yes.
You can decentralize it. You will have less chance of sabotage of the electrical grid, and some of the problems you mentioned might be lessened by not depending on one big, massive power grid.
That's part of this. That's part of the transition that will be happening, certainly.
And
Yes.
that is a very strong transition in Hawaii, where photovoltaic is so important. And they
And
have
are
no
everywhere.
petroleum resources.
Yeah,
Mhm.
you see photovoltaic cells on almost every roof now. A big change from 15 years ago when I left.
Now, how is Hawaii doing about implementing floating wind? Because that's one of the big things. I think part of the problem with Hawaii is the water gets deep pretty fast. So if you're using water-based wind power, it needs to be floating systems because it's.
Well, up at the north end of the island, they have a lot of wind turbines, a
Mhm.
lot of them. But I don't know of offshore installations.
Mhm.
Well,
Anyway, that,
Richard,
yes,
if we
go
want to
ahead.
move on from electrical stuff to space, what's this about two historic flybys of Venus?
Well, we hadn't made many Venus missions in a long time, and last week we had two missions fly by pretty close. They're both from the European Space Agency, and one mission is the Solar Orbital mission, and another one is called Bepi Colombo, and they both made historic Venus flybys last week, and they passed Venus within 33 hours of each other. And the solar orbiter flew past Venus at about 8,000 kilometers, and the Bepi Colombo mission went by Venus at 550 kilometers, so it was quite close. And these, though they are taking the advantage to study Venus, neither of these missions is really aimed at Venus. The Bepi Colombo is going to make flybys of Mercury and was just going by Venus to give it acceleration to move to Mercury. And the solar orbiter is going to end up, as you might imagine from its name, orbiting around the sun, and will give us the first ever views of the sun's north and south poles. And while they were in the neighborhood of Venus, the first thing is you have to be impressed, I think, by the deep space navigation work, because they got the trajectories accurate within a few kilometers when they started out almost 200 million kilometers further away. And so getting your flight path accurate to within a few kilometers over a distance of 200 million is, I think, a pretty good job. And now one of the things that they saw was this rapid increase of heat when you go from the night side to the day side. For example, the solar panels went from temperatures of minus 100 C to plus 10 C when they went from the shadow into the light. And another thing that they were able to see and detect was the gravitational pull of the planet. And while they were doing it, they also were able to collect data on the Venusian magnetic plasma and particle environment that was around the spacecraft. So they're learning more about the Venusian environment. And then another thing that they were able to see was this sudden transition of the spacecraft into the very calm solar wind as they went through the bow shock, the location where the planet's magnetosphere meets the solar wind. And they were able to record this. So they were doing some good science on the ways. They also, of course, got lots of pictures and film. It's still not, they didn't have the best cameras for this, so that was not the aim of the mission, but they still got new photographs. And again, they were able to monitor the ions circulating in the magnetosphere in the close vicinity of Venus. And this helps them understand the electric fields and processes in the ionosphere and atmosphere. So though these missions were not aimed at Venus, they used Venus to help them slingshot to their next locations. And while they were in the neighborhood, they got some good science. I'm actually pretty interested in both the missions' further results to be orbiting around the sun, and to know more about Mercury seemed to me to be interesting and worthwhile goals.
Any thoughts? Well then, Richard, if nobody wants to talk about Venus, how about getting energy from fusion? Is fusion really here? Breaking records? Tell us about it.
Well, fusion isn't here yet, but this was an interesting development from several points of view. The biggest point of view, I think, is you've heard about all the Tokamak reactors that they're building to do fusion with these gigantic, high-powered, superconducting magnets, making this donut that is powerful enough to contain 10 times the temperature of the sun that's going on in the reaction. Well, this didn't use any of that. It's a whole different approach. And what they were doing is firing an enormous beams of light from the world's largest lasers into a tiny pellet of hydrogen. And what they were able to do is to result in a burst of energy that was more than 10 quadrillion watts. That's a lot of watts. If you imagine your 7.5 watt LED light bulb, that's only, let's see, a quadrillion is bigger than a million and bigger than a billion. So it's a lot more than powers that light bulb. And in fact, the power they got out was roughly 10% of the energy of sunlight that falls on the Earth. And so that's a pretty big output. And it's and another measurement is it was 1.3 megajoules. And probably most of you are not familiar, but a joule is another measurement of energy. And in February, they tried a similar technique, and at that time created the record performance, which was 170 kilojoules. Here, they got 1.3 megajoules, so they got about 8 times greater output than ever before. Again, it just to call it a short time is overstatement. It was in 100 trillionths of a second. So it wasn't very long, but it was hot. And this is an enormous step forward. And this was still, though, was only about 70% of what is needed to get to what they call ignition, which is the state where it starts to generate more energy than put in by the lasers. It's hard to imagine the power supply that these lasers had to generate that much energy. And while this might be promising for a new technique for fusion besides these tokamaks, then there still is a problem. To be able to have this drive a fusion reaction, you would need to be able to do this several times a second. And right now, these lasers can provide this burst of energy about once a day. So some development work has to be done on the lasers. They're actually busy trying to do that now. And to give you another idea, is this uses an array of laser light amplifiers that is the size of 3 football fields to focus this beam on a tiny hydrogen pellet. So it's a lot of energy coming in focused in a small area. And they're saying that this demonstrates to the skeptic that there is nothing fundamentally wrong with the concept of laser fusion. And in fact, it is time for the US to move forward with a major laser fusion energy program. Of course, the interest in fusion is driven by the environmental catastrophe underway, because fusion is certainly a carbon-free way to generate energy, and fusion does not have the dangerous waste products that fission does.
Any comments?
They'd be better off focusing their energy on making safe, efficient nuclear power, because that's the real immediate need, is electricity to replace coal-fired power station. This could wait 100 years and we wouldn't suffer for it. But if we postpone the generation of safe fission power, we'll really suffer.
Now, in the case of the Tokamak reactors, the test that they're currently working on says that they expect proof of the technique, which means it's able for a sustained time to pass break even. They expect that proof to be in 5 years, and the technology they use with that is well enough established that if they're able to do that, they expect it won't be long, just a few more years until it's able to start having reactors on the grid. So they think that it can be there fast enough to make some significant impact. I'm not saying that you're wrong.
No, they've been saying fusion power is a decade away since about 1960.
Right, and they've been saying
And it's
it's more
still
than that,
too-
but it's still, they're still saying it, but
Yes.
now they're saying we're gonna have the proof in 4 years, and that is the first change, and they're saying it's a decade away, in the last 50 years. We'll see.
Richard, if we're moving on to biology, question, what are blockchains and what's that got to do with how we define life?
Well, it's interesting. Uh, you know, Perhaps one of the most fundamental puzzles in biology is what is life? And there's a new paper by the Planetary Science Institute that talks about this. And this presents evidence that the order that is observed in biological systems is fundamentally computational. And they are saying further, based on a theoretical foundation that incorporates the principles of self-organization and evolution across a wide variety of life forms, that again, kind of trying to confirm this definition of biological systems as fundamentally computational. And a blockchain is a computer system where different elements are tied together in a chain. And right now they're using cryptography to implement ways to make secure ways to put the chains together. And these chains can be built into very complex things. And they're talking about what they call a blockchain-based distributed virtual machine, or DVM, that's composed of thousands of computers which collectively function as a global general purpose computer. And these DVMs possess characteristics that are associated with biological systems that are based on chains of DNA that are linked together. And so they say there are a number of functional and structural similarities between blockchain and DNA. And in practice, these DNA chains are like a medium which contains instruction that are digital instructions like computer code, and this DNA is replicated across thousands of nodes, just like these blockchains are. And the paper states that such blockchain-based systems fit some of the criteria of life, specifically response to the environment, growth, change, replication, and self-regulation. And so what they're talking about is the potential of making self-sufficient distributed organisms, if you can call something from computers an organism, that has sufficient intelligence to be able to essentially qualify as a living being. And they are in the midst of trying to develop such systems that can be distributed around the world soon, they think. And they think these systems, now one of the advantages of computer life over human life is there actually are several advantages. One is the ability to pass acquired traits off to their offspring. So as your computer blockchain life learns about its environment, is able to do new things, it can pass its learning on to its children. Then also, uh, we know that these computers are a lot faster than our brain is. Our brain does a lot because it's so complex, but compared to computers, it's really, really slow. And then, so we have more speed, we have accuracy, and it's easier to make redundancy, which means a particular failure is not going to kill the computer. And the other thing about the DVMs is they potentially have an unlimited lifespan. So we can make computers that act like living organisms that are immortal. And when I read stuff like this, I wonder, gee, in a world like this, what's the place for humans?
Any thoughts?
Unless we can transfer our consciousness into one of those computers without realizing that we're dead.
Well, that I've read sci-fi about that for 50 years.
Yeah.
Richard, if we want to move on to humans, you ask, should we get fecal transplants from our grandchildren? And you apparently ask this because fecal transplants have reversed signs of brain aging in mice. Tell us about it.
Well, you already told it all, so I don't need to say much. I will say, as you age, your brain slows down. And now there is new hope because of these rodent experiments that some of these declines can be reversed. And this research shows that a transplant of gut microbes, like we call the microbiome, in the form of feces from young mice to old mice can turn back the clock on aging brains. They are very careful to warn that more work must be done before considering doing anything similar with humans. But I don't know, when you're getting pretty old and you don't have much time for this work, some people do crazy things. And what they know is the gut microbiome changes over the course of a lifespan, but they hadn't before this been able to identify any impact on age-related declines. But now, what they did is they took young mice, equivalent to young adults, and transplanted this fecal material into old mice about our age in mouse terms. The transplant procedure is not one that I personally want to do. What they did is they fed a slurry of feces to the old mice using a feeding tube. I guess the feeding tube makes it more palatable. And they did it twice a week for 8 weeks. And the first thing they noticed was the microbiomes of the old mouse started to look like the microbiomes of young mice. And then they saw there were brain changes as well. Specifically the hippocampus, which is a part of the brain that is associated with learning and memory in mice as well as men. The hippocampus became physically and chemically similar to the hippocampus of young mice. And when they tested these old mice that had received this treatment, they could solve mazes faster, and we're better at remembering the maze layout. And they say, quote, it's almost like we could press the rewind button on the aging process. They did see some things that didn't change. For example, the old mice didn't become more social, which was young mice are more social, just like young humans are more social. And they still have more study to do and warn again about jumping the gun to humans, but they say this work offers hope.
Any thoughts?
Nobody's ready for their
Well,
fecal transplant. I bet you are,
Well,
Fred.
Well, Richard,
when the company starts up to introduce this, they could call it shit for brains. Because
Well, I thought for a while they had a marketing problem because you have to figure out a good name for it.
Richard, some time ago, Norman and I were talking about doing a different thing of taking blood from young people and injecting it into ourselves and being able to transform ourselves. And so he was wondering whether some of us should make our grandchildren worried that we want their blood. Now, this wouldn't have the same implication, eh?
No, that's right.
This and nobody gets hurt. Is that right?
That's right. You just have to collect, I guess you would call it the sample from your grandchild. And I'm not sure what feeding system you would use. Maybe the slurry in a tube down your throat where it just bypassed the mouth is not such a bad idea.
The silly problem.
I think they use that tube because they want to bypass the stomach, where the stomach acids would affect the biome. So they want to get it beyond that part of the digestion system.
I wonder whether Lance Armstrong would have preferred doing that to blood doping.
Well, it would doing this would really change your relationship with your grandkids.
No, Richard, there wasn't any attempt, rather than doing it with infusion, to doing it with an animal, was there?
Right now, this was just one test, and they did it this way. And they want to do more testing.
Like I think I wanted with an enema.
Uh-huh.
Well, I don't know about a dog.
I assume next they'll do it on monkeys.
Well, yeah, I could just see that these mouse basically were able to talk and say, this tastes like shit.
Well, Richard, for our last story, what's this about Moderna's HIV vaccine about to start human trials for more diseases? What's that?
So trials for the first mRNA-based HIV vaccine will start maybe next week. So that's pretty soon. And these will be phase 1 human trials, which are basically just to test the safety. And it'll be given to 56 participants with ages from 18 to 50. So this is the first part of these. You've heard of stage 3 trials. This is phase 1 trial, which just start to look at the safety. And while HIV treatments have come a long way, so far, though they've made a number of attempts at vaccines, none of the vaccines has been able to produce the broadly neutralizing antibodies that are able to trigger the kind of healthy immune response that we need. This Moderna candidate, however, looks very promising, and it's a new use. It's one of the things that would really prove the mRNA systems as the new way to approach disease fighting. And if it's successful, it could really change the future of disease fighting and vaccine development around the world. So keep tuned and see what's going to happen.
Any thoughts? Well, Richard, maybe that signals it's the end of today, but thank you so much for this, and thanks to everybody for participating. And once again, we'll see you all next week. Bye for now.
Adios.
Bye.
Richard.
Bye.
Thank you, Richard. A lot of work.
All right. Adios.
Adios.